Jay and Neang Ruot. Two young village people called Jay and Neang Ruot were engaged to be married. One afternoon, as Jay was looking after cattle in the fields, Neang Ruot walked up to him and they began to chat. Soon the young man said, "The sun is setting. We must go home before dark." His fiancée looked at him very boldly. "I want to see you again," she said, "tonight at my place." Jay was taken aback. Very few girls would dare suggest such a meeting because Cambodian society is strict and young people cannot spend a lot of time together before they are married, and especially not at night. He stuttered, "How can I go to your place? Your father sleeps near the door, and if he hears me go up the stairs and into the house he'll kill me." Neang Ruot replied, "I'll tie a rope to a basket and lower it from the window. If you tie in the basket, I'll pull you up to my room. Tonight, keep touching your ear. When it feels cold, then it will be time for you to come to me." That night, as soon as his ear felt cold, Jay went to his fiancée's house and sat in the basket beneath her window. But Neang Ruot was not strong enough to pull him more than a few centimeters from the ground. Then the rope broke and the basket thumped down in the hard earth. Jay groaned at the shaking he got, and the dog, woken by the noise, started to bark. Neang Ruot's father, fearing that thieves were stealing his cattle, rushed downstairs with an axe. He struck at the human form lying on the ground and just missed the head. As he bent to try again, he was amazed to recognize his future son-in-law. "What are you doing here at this time of night?" Exclamation mark. He gasped. "I've come to see your daughter." The father was both shocked and angry. "How dare you? Whose idea was this?" Jay hung his head. "Your daughter's." "Neang Ruot, come here," called the father. "Is it true that this was your idea?" "Yes, father." The father frowned. "What a shameless girl you are." From that moment, Neang Ruot's parents decided to marry the couple immediately before anything should happen to disgrace their family. The next morning, Neang Ruot's father said to Jay, "I think you and my daughter should marry within a day or two. Please go and buy some ducks for the wedding feast." He gave Jay some money and sent him off to a nearby village famous for its fat ducks for the wedding feast. He gave Jay some money and sent him off to a nearby village famous for its fat ducks. Close to the village, Jay saw many ducks swimming on a large pond. He asked a small boy playing nearby, "Do those ducks belong to you?" The child was amazed that a grown man could think that a mere lad might own a whole flock of ducks. He hesitated and then said, "Yes." "Why?" "I'm going to be married, my boy," said Jay, "and I ducks for my wedding feast. Will you sell me some?" "Certainly," replied the child. "You can have all of them for 300 reals, but you will have to catch them yourself." "That's a very good bargain," said Jay, and he paid the boy, who ran off as fast as his legs could carry him. The cunning child well knew that the birds on the pond were not fat farm ducks, whose wings were clipped, but lean wild ducks. As Jay went into the water to catch them, they flew off. He watched as they rose higher and higher into the sky. They must be going to heaven, he thought. By now, evening was falling and it began to rain. Jay took shelter under a newly built house on the edge of the village. It belonged to a couple who had just married and were spending their first night together. "When I am with you, my dear," said the husband to his young wife, "I feel that I'm going to heaven." When Jay heard this, he could not contain himself. "If you're going to heaven," he yelled, "please catch some ducks for me." "Who's that?" said the husband. "We're supposed to be alone." He grabbed a stick, rushed downstairs and laid into Jay, who fled for home in the rain and dark without money and without ducks. Neang Ruot's father shook his head sadly when Jay told him what had happened, and the next day went himself to buy food for the wedding feast. A few days after the wedding, Jay's father-in-law told him, "We need oxen to plow our fields. Go and buy a pair for me. Here is the money." Then he added, "Remember, we are not rich, so please buy a pair of small animals. The smallest possible." Jay took the money and went to a farmer who had oxen for sale. The man showed him the cattle, but Jay hesitated. I wonder if these are what my father-in-law wants. He asked me to buy a pair of very small animals, the smallest possible. The farmer, who was quick-witted and cunning, said, just a moment. I may have something to suit you. He showed Jay a pair of beetles. You see, he said, these are very small animals indeed. Jay gave a shout of joy. Just the thing. That must be exactly what Dad meant. Thank you so much, and he paid the farmer and ran home. Where are the animals? Asked his father-in-law. Watch out, Dad, you'll stand on them, said foolish Jay. They're just what you wanted, the smallest possible, and he pointed to the beetles. What a stupid fellow you are, said his father-in-law sadly. One day a little later Neang Ruot said to Jay, you'd better go to the lake and bathe before dinner. After you've had a good dip, take a mud bath too, just like the water buffaloes do. It's very good for your skin. Yes, dear, said Jay obediently and did exactly as she suggested. But the foolish fellow didn't wash off the mud and came home plastered in brown, sticky earth which began to harden. I don't feel comfortable, I'll have to get this off, he said and started to wipe himself with an old pillow. The mud was so dry by now that the pillowcase tore and he got covered in the feathers that fell out of it. If Neang Ruot sees me like this she'll scold me, he thought, so he went to hide in the loft where the rice was stored. When Neang Ruot came in she noticed a strange figure in it, the feathery figure half hidden in the shadows, and said, it must be the rice grain god. Quickly, burn some incense and call your mother to come so that we can all kneel and welcome the rice grain god to our home. We are honored to have you here, God from the east, he began respectfully. Which direction is east, Dad? Came a familiar voice from the loft. Oh, not you again, you stupid fellow, said the father in exasperation. His wife and daughter laughed at the queer brown and white figure and ordered Jay back to the lake to wash off the mud and feathers. In time, the couple had a child. One day Neang Ruot asked Jay, will look after the baby for me while I go to the fields to work? Certainly, said her husband. Soon after Neang Ruot left the house the baby began to cry. Jay rocked it in its tiny hammock made out of a towel tied at both ends with string and fastened between two posts, but the child cried on and on. I must see if there is anything wrong with it, he thought. He examined the child thoroughly from the toes up. When he reached the top of its head he noticed the pulse beating where the two parts of the skull bone had not yet joined together. Look at that beating pulse. It must be a boil. No wonder the baby's crying. I'd better get a knife and lance the boil, he said to himself. He found a sharp knife and cut into the baby's head. Blood poured out and, as its life ebbed away, the baby gradually stopped crying. When Neang Ruot came home Jay announced proudly, you don't know how to look after our child. No wonder it cried. Didn't you know it had a boil that needed lancing? Now that I've attended to the boil the baby doesn't cry anymore. Neang Ruot rushed to where the baby lay in the blood-soaked hammock. You've killed our child, she gasped, horrified. Stupid Jay didn't know what to say. When the first feeling of shock had left her Neang Ruot said to Jay, you had better take our child's body and bury it. Jay wrapped the tiny form in a mat, then carrying it under one arm, and with tools under the other, he went off to dig a little grave. He was so upset and in such a daze that he didn't notice when the dead baby slipped from the mat under his arm and fell onto the road. He dug the grave, placed the mat in it, covered it with earth and walked back home. On the way, he came across the tiny body by the roadside. He took one look at it then rushed to his wife. Neang Ruot, he said, other babies have died too. I have just buried our child but there's another one lying dead beside the road. Perhaps there's a sickness going around. Neang Ruot went to see what had happened and as soon as she drew near to the child on the road she buried only the mat. How could you? She cried. This time she carried the baby's body to the grave and stayed with her foolish husband to make sure that their child was properly buried. Neang Ruot left home very early in the morning to visit a husband. When the sun comes up, put some rice out to dry, not much, just enough for us tonight. Put it on some cloth or a mat, any old thing will do, even a skin. Leave it in the heat all day. I'll cook it when I come home. Jay could not find a piece of colt or a mat. She said something about skin, he thought. Perhaps my skin will do. So he picked up 2 fistfuls of rice and stood outside all day, his hands, full of rice, outstretched to the sun. When Neang Ruot came home, she found the rice fine and dry and her husband so sunburnt that she could hardly recognize him. What a foolish man! She sighed. That's not fair, objected Jay. I do everything you ask, you never praise me. That's because you can't do anything right, replied Neang Ruot. And so she did, for Jay and Neang Ruot lived together until a ripe old age.